And we're starting with the breaking news we ended last hour with. A New York appeals court has thrown out a massive civil fraud penalty against President Trump, a total that exceeded $500 million. They're calling that penalty excessive. Joining us now, NBC News legal Avalos and NBC News legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach. Danny, break down this ruling for us.
Well, it's a lengthy ruling, and all the judges disagreed on their analysis, but they agreed on one final decision, which was that this judgment against Trump was a fine within the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment and excessive fines. And in addition, it was punitive and it was excessive. That's really the conclusion. They concluded that because this was a punitive measure because there weren't any victims who were compensated. It was just a judgment against the company and against Trump. So the court here concluded with a lot of disagreement among them, but did conclude that this was an excessive fine within the meaning of the Constitution's Eighth Amendment.
Danny, when you say that this was a lengthy ruling, we're talking to the tune of more than 300 pages. So we know that folks.
Okay, so what just happened in a Washington, D.C. federal courthouse might be the most significant judicial rebuke of presidential power we've seen since Watergate. Judge Tanya Chutkan just delivered an absolutely devastating rejection of Trump's emergency appeal to protect Attorney General Pam Bondi. And she did it in such forceful terms that legal experts are calling it a thunderbolt that will reverberate through American jurisprudence for decades. The court's ruling, delivered amid heavy security and nationwide news coverage, didn't just deny Trump's appeal. It essentially told the former president and his legal team that their attempts to place themselves above the law would not be tolerated by the federal judiciary. The judge insisted that no one, not even a sitting president or his officials, is above the law or immune from oversight, language that directly challenges the entire theory of executive power that Trump has been pushing. The scene at the courthouse was unlike anything we typically see for legal proceedings: heavy security, crowds of protesters and supporters, media trucks lining the streets, and a palpable sense that history was being made inside that courtroom. The security measures weren't just standard procedure. There were credible threats against the judge, the courthouse, and anyone involved in holding Trump and Bondi accountable. The fact that delivering justice now requires this level of security tells you everything about how poisoned our political atmosphere has become and how dangerous it is to stand up to corrupt power. Judge Chutkan walked into that courthouse knowing she was putting a target on her back, and she delivered her ruling anyway. The specifics of what Judge Chutkan rejected are crucial to understanding why this is such a big deal. Trump's emergency appeal wasn't just asking for a delay or a procedural adjustment. It was essentially arguing that as president, his administration officials should be immune from certain types of judicial oversight, that the attorney general should have special protection from criminal investigation while in office, and that the executive branch could determine for itself what documents could be withheld from courts and Congress. These aren't minor legal arguments. They're fundamental challenges to the separation of powers and the rule of law itself. By rejecting them so forcefully, Judge Chutkan has drawn a line in the sand that even presidents cannot cross. The language the judge used in her opinion deserves special attention because federal judges typically use measured, careful language even when ruling against powerful people. But Judge Chutkan pulled no punches, describing Bondi's conduct as contemptuous and wholly incompatible with the responsibilities of the Justice Department. When a federal judge uses the word contemptuous, they're not just saying someone acted badly, they're saying the person showed deliberate disrespect for the law and the court itself. This kind of language from a federal judge is extraordinary and signals just how egregious Bondi's conduct was and how offended the judiciary is by the Trump team's attempts to excuse it. The refusal to stay sanctions or the ongoing ethics inquiry means that everything continues full speed ahead against Bondi, regardless of Trump's protests or threats. Trump's team was essentially asking the judge to hit pause on all the consequences Bondi faces while they figure out their next move. But Judge Chutkan said absolutely not. The sanctions remain in place. The ethics investigation continues. The criminal referrals proceed, and Bondi continues to face the full weight of justice without delay or special treatment. This is particularly significant because it means Bondi could be arrested, charged, and potentially jailed even while Trump continues to appeal, removing any leverage the Trump team thought they had. The revelation that court documents show Bondi's alleged document removal and false testimony are now under criminal investigation with outside special counsels being considered for prosecution adds another layer of severity to this situation. We're not just talking about judicial sanctions or bar discipline anymore. We're talking about federal criminal prosecution by independent prosecutors who won't be subject to political pressure or interference. The consideration of outside special counsels suggests that the corruption is so severe and so widespread that normal prosecutors might be conflicted out, requiring truly independent investigation and prosecution to ensure justice is served. Legal experts appearing on national news to analyze this ruling aren't using their typical measured academic language. They're using terms like thunderbolt and watershed moment because they recognize this as a fundamental confrontation between judicial independence and executive overreach. The comparison to Watergate and the Nixon-Tate's case is particularly apt because those were the last times we saw such a direct confrontation between a president claiming special powers and a judiciary insisting that no one is above the law. But in some ways, this is even more significant because it involves not just presidential records, but the Attorney General personally stealing classified documents and lying about it under oath. Okay, so the Trump team's legal arguments that Judge Chutkan just demolished weren't just weak. They were essentially asking the court to abandon fundamental principles of American democracy and accept that the president and his appointees operate in a legal zone where normal rules don't apply. Trump's lawyers argued that the Attorney General needs special protection to function effectively, that judicial oversight of executive branch document handling violates separation of powers, and that the president should have unreviewable discretion over which documents are provided to courts and Congress. These arguments, if accepted, would essentially create an imperial presidency where the executive branch polices itself without any meaningful oversight from the other branches of government. The judge's systematic destruction of each of these arguments reads like a masterclass in constitutional law and judicial independence. On the claim that the Attorney General needs special protection, Judge Chutkan pointed out that the Attorney General's duty is to uphold the law, not break it, and that giving the AG immunity from consequences for criminal conduct would make them more powerful than the law itself. She noted that throughout American history, attorneys general have functioned effectively while being subject to legal oversight, and that Bondi's criminal conduct doesn't deserve protection just because she holds high office, if anything. Her position makes her crimes worse because she betrayed a special trust. The separation of powers argument that Trump's team made was particularly audacious. They essentially claimed that the judiciary has no business reviewing executive branch document handling, even when those documents are stolen classified materials and grand jury records. Judge Chutkan's response was devastating. She pointed out that the judiciary has not only the right, but the obligation to ensure that its own processes aren't corrupted by executive branch criminality. When an attorney general steals grand jury materials, that's not an executive branch internal matter. That's a direct attack on the judicial branch that requires judicial response. The separation of powers doesn't mean the branches are hermetically sealed from each other. It means each branch can check abuses by the others. The argument about presidential discretion over documents was perhaps the most dangerous because it would essentially allow the president to hide any evidence of wrongdoing by simply declaring it privileged or refusing to produce it. Judge Chutkan noted that this argument has been rejected repeatedly throughout American history, most notably in United States versus Nixon, where the Supreme Court unanimously held that even the president must comply with judicial subpoenas for evidence in criminal cases. She pointed out that accepting Trump's argument would mean that presidents could commit crimes and then hide the evidence, making them effectively immune from prosecution or even investigation. What makes Judge Chutkan's ruling particularly powerful is that she didn't just reject these arguments on narrow technical grounds. She explained why accepting them would fundamentally transform American democracy into something unrecognizable. She wrote that if the court accepted Trump's theories, it would create a system where the executive branch could violate any law without consequence as long as it involved documents they chose to keep secret. This would make congressional oversight impossible, judicial review meaningless, and the rule of law optional for those in power. Her opinion reads less like a legal ruling and more like a defense of democracy itself against authoritarian overreach. The direct challenge to Trump's legal arguments signals something incredibly important about the judiciary's willingness to push back against political pressure and attempts at executive overreach. Federal judges are typically cautious about directly confronting presidents or appearing political, but Judge Chutkan clearly felt that the threat to judicial independence and the rule of law was so severe that diplomatic language was inappropriate. Her ruling essentially tells Trump and his legal team that their attempts to intimidate or bypass the judiciary will not work, that judges will do their duty regardless of political pressure, and that the law applies equally to everyone no matter how powerful they are or who appointed them. The impact of this ruling on other Trump-related legal cases cannot be overstated. Prosecutors in various jurisdictions who have been investigating Trump and his associates now have a powerful precedent that courts will not accept claims of executive immunity or special privilege. Defense lawyers who were planning to use similar arguments in other cases are now reconsidering their strategies. The ruling essentially closes off an entire avenue of defense that Trump's team was counting on, the idea that being president or working for the president creates a special legal status that provides protection from normal legal consequences. Okay, so this decisive court action dramatically escalates the legal peril, not just for Bondi, but for Trump himself and potentially dozens of other administration officials who may have been involved in or aware of the document theft and obstruction. When a federal judge this forcefully rejects presidential claims of special privilege and immunity, it sends a signal to prosecutors everywhere that the courts will back them up if they pursue charges against even the highest-ranking officials. The criminal investigation with outside special counsels being considered means we could be looking at the largest corruption prosecution in American history, potentially reaching all the way to Trump himself if evidence shows he directed or knew about Bondi's criminal conduct. The public calls for accountability, transparency, and the separation of powers that are being fueled by this ruling are growing louder and more insistent by the day. Citizens who had become cynical about whether powerful people ever face consequences are seeing a federal judge stand up to a former president and his corrupt attorney general, and it's rekindling hope that the system might actually work. Protests are being organized, petitions are circulating, and civic groups are mobilizing to demand that this moment of judicial courage leads to real accountability, not just symbolic gestures. The public pressure on prosecutors to follow through with criminal charges is becoming intense and impossible to ignore. The comparison to watershed court moments defying presidential pressure, particularly Watergate and the Nixon tapes case, helps us understand the historical significance of what we're witnessing. During Watergate, the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling that Nixon had to turn over the tapes essentially ended his presidency because it showed that even the president was subject to law. Judge Chutkan's ruling could have similar implications for Trump and his associates. It establishes that their claims of special privilege won't protect them from criminal prosecution, which means the various investigations surrounding them can proceed without the delays and obstructions they were counting on. The security measures that surrounded this ruling and will continue to be necessary for everyone involved in holding Trump and Bondi accountable represent a dark new chapter in American judicial history. Judges are receiving death threats for doing their jobs, prosecutors need bodyguards, and witnesses are being intimidated. The fact that delivering justice now requires courage not just in the legal sense, but in the physical sense, risking actual violence, shows how much damage Trump's attacks on the rule of law have done to American society. When enforcing the law becomes physically dangerous, we're approaching the breakdown of civilized society. The willingness of the judiciary to assert its independence despite these political headwinds gives us a glimpse of how this crisis might resolve. If judges continue to show the courage Judge Chutkan has displayed, if they refuse to be intimidated or corrupted, then the rule of law might survive this assault. But it requires extraordinary courage from ordinary people in judicial robes, and we can't take for granted that every judge will show that courage. The system is being tested in ways it hasn't been tested since the Civil War, and the outcome is far from certain. The frequently marked clashes between Trump and the judiciary throughout his presidency are culminating in this moment of direct confrontation. Trump spent years attacking judges who ruled against him, calling them biased, incompetent, and worse. He tried to pack the courts with loyalists who would protect him. He argued that the executive branch should be supreme over the other branches. Now, a federal judge has essentially said no to all of that, establishing that the judiciary will not bow to presidential pressure and will fulfill its constitutional role as a check on executive power, regardless of the political consequences. The consideration of outside special counsels for prosecution suggests that the scope of criminality being investigated goes far beyond just Bondi's document theft and perjury. When you meet outside prosecutors because your entire Justice Department might be compromised, you're looking at systemic corruption that could involve dozens of officials. The special counsels will have broad authority to investigate not just the specific crimes already identified, but any other crimes they discover in the course of their investigation. This could lead to a cascade of indictments that reaches into every corner of the Trump administration. The message this sends to future presidents and attorneys general about the limits of executive power is crystal clear. You are not above the law, you cannot escape oversight, and if you commit crimes, you will face consequences regardless of your position. This is a fundamental reaffirmation of the principle that America is a nation of laws, not men, and that no one, no matter how powerful, gets to place themselves outside the legal system. Future administrations will think twice before attempting the kind of systematic obstruction and corruption that characterized the Trump era. The impact on the 2024 and future elections could be profound if this investigation continues to expand and more officials are charged. Candidates will have to answer whether they support the rule of law or Trump's vision of executive immunity. The Republican Party will face an existential choice between continuing to support Trump despite mounting evidence of criminality or finally breaking with him to preserve the party's future. Democrats will use this as evidence that Trump and his allies are fundamentally corrupt and cannot be trusted with power. The entire political landscape could be reshaped by how this legal drama plays out. The international implications of America demonstrating that it can hold even its most powerful officials accountable, or failing to do so, will affect global democracy for generations. If America shows that presidents and attorneys general can steal classified documents and lie under oath without consequences, it sends a signal to autocrats everywhere that democracy is weak and corruption is inevitable. But if America demonstrates that its institutions are strong enough to hold even the powerful accountable, it could inspire democratic movements worldwide and reestablish American moral leadership. As we watch this unprecedented confrontation between judicial independence and executive corruption unfold, we're witnessing something that will be studied in law schools and history classes for centuries. This is not just another political scandal or legal dispute. This is a fundamental test of whether the American experiment in self-government can survive an assault from within by those who swore to protect it. Judge Chutkan's courage in standing up to Trump and Bondi, despite the personal risks, shows that at least some Americans are willing to fight for the rule of law. Whether enough others will join her to preserve democracy remains to be seen. The path forward from here is uncertain but consequential. Will prosecutors have the courage to bring charges against Bondi and potentially Trump himself? Will other judges show the same backbone as Judge Chutkan when faced with similar pressure? Will the public demand accountability forcefully enough that politicians can't ignore it? Will the system ultimately work to punish corruption and reestablish the rule of law? Or will this be another moment where the powerful escape consequences while democracy erodes further? These questions will be answered in the coming months, and the answers will determine not just the fate of individuals, but the future of American democracy itself.
Remember that these aren't just abstract legal principles at stake. It's the fundamental nature of American government. Will we remain a nation where courts can check presidential power, where the rule of law prevails over authoritarian ambition, where meritless arguments are rejected regardless of who makes them? The D.C. courts are answering with a resounding yes, and their strikes against Trump's appeals represent victories not just for his opponents, but for the American constitutional system itself. The story is far from over, but the pattern is clear. Trump's legal strategies are failing catastrophically, and the courts are prepared to continue striking down his attempts to exceed his authority. Every defeat weakens Trump's position, emboldens his opponents, and reinforces the principle that in America, the law is supreme, even over the president. The D.C. courts haven't just rejected Trump's appeals, they've rejected his entire vision of unlimited presidential power. And that rejection will echo through American history as a moment when the judiciary stood firm against authoritarian threat.